Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our series of broadcasts about Pensacola's great history, the first place city in North America. We are today talking about the second episode, the second time we are discussing the story of the great British period here in Pensacola, which ran, of course, from 1763 until 1781. In our last story, we told you about how the British happened to come to Pensacola in the first place, how Governor Johnstone, the incoming governor, was dissatisfied with what he found here as a Spanish settlement, how engineer Elias Durnford then had come out here and totally relaid out the city to make it look basically like the downtown Pensacola area that we have today. And then how step by step tradesmen and professional people began to come. People were sent out here on subsidy to occupy farmlands along the Mississippi River, and then the Indian trade had begun using the work of John Stuart for this. And so we were at the end of the first 2 years of productive work. And of course, as all of this is happening, now step by step, the new settlers are coming in here. They are building their homes basically on a very simple pattern, because virtually all of the houses that were built at this time were built of wood, and much of that wood, of course, was created with a small lumber mill that was built on the outskirts of the city. And of course, step by step, you began to have people opening the various trades. There was probably a downtown baker. Maybe, I doubt this, but there might have even been a wig maker here and this sort of thing. And all of the tradesmen that came provided their specialties, so that step by step, those who were coming began to feel that they were at home here in Pensacola, in the British West Florida. Now, other things were beginning to happen as well as all of this proceeded, because under the new rule for British Florida, this colony was to be ruled overall by a governor and a royal council. And the council included 5 men, all of whom were appointed by the Board of Trade, appointed by them and paid for them. This included an attorney general and a head of finance and a head of defense and so forth. And all of them worked with the governor. And the contract, the charter that they had, also permitted the creation of a locally elected assembly. And George Johnstone would get around to that just very, very shortly. The assembly, of course, was much like we've all read about in our school books about Virginia and the House of Burgesses they had here. Well, Pensacola had its own version of the House of Burgesses beginning just a year or so after George Johnstone arrived. Now, as all of this began, of course, other things began to move into place. George Johnstone was supposed to have as his helper a lieutenant governor, and at first this gentleman just didn't show up. But into the year 1765, he did. And his name was Montefort Brown. Montefort Brown was another ex-soldier, a very successful one, and he was a man full of ideas. And as he began his plan to come out here, he looked around. He said, what we're trying to do is find good citizens to come in and inhabit Pensacola. He said, now, who would likely come beside people in Great Britain? And he got out his map of France, and he noticed that southern France was almost opposite Pensacola. And he said, well, what kind of people are over there? Well, he found this. Southern France was heavily populated by Huguenots. And Huguenots, of course, were still religious dissenters inside largely Catholic France. And these Huguenots were farmers, many of them. And so Montefort Brown, on his own, decided to go to southern France, talk to some people, and he signed up 46 Huguenots and their preacher, and they agreed to come. And of course, they brought with them seedlings for grapes, for indigo, and for wine. And they put all of these cuttings on their vessel, and they came and arrived with Mr. Brown, totally by surprise, and of course were royally welcomed by Governor Johnstone and the others. Now the question was, where will we put these people? They're farmers. They're not going to inhabit downtown Pensacola. So they located appropriate land up Escambia Gate, where it seemed like the weather, the breezes, the land, the soil would be hospitable to what they wanted to do. And these people settled in there and began a little sub-village to Pensacola, which they called Campbelltown. And this began to work out quite well in the first year. Now, I wish I could tell you that all of what the Huguenots did was a success. But at the end of 2 years, they came to George Johnstone and said, "Sir, we're sorry, but not a thing that we planted has grown well. This just isn't going to work. And so they picked up and they moved away from Pensacola. These Huguenots resettled in near what is now to Abbeville, South Carolina, where there already there was a considerable Huguenot settlement, and they began a settlement which became a very successful part of southwestern Carolina. Well, about this same time, Pensacola finally got its first clergyman. They'd had trouble recruiting a preacher before that because once again the travel guides hadn't been making this look like the most beautiful place to come. But finally, in 1765, a Reverend Nath Cotton agreed to come. And Nath Cotton had two jobs. He was to be the clergyman for the Church of England, and he was also to be the schoolmaster. And Nath Cotton arrived, and he set up his headquarters in Government House right down on the water and began doing both of his jobs. He was quite successful. There are a number of wonderful reports on what he did. He was repeatedly sent reports back to the Bishop of London, so we know some of the things specifically that he accomplished. And one particular year, in 1766, he was so pleased because in that year his statistics showed that he had baptized 62 people while he had only had to bury he baptized 82 people while he had only had to bury 63. And he thought that the things were really looking up. He was very successful as a schoolmaster, and things were going well for him. And then, unfortunately, he developed pneumonia, and he died early in 1767. And the coming and going of ministers after that is, we do not have a very good record of that. It's about this same time now that Governor Johnstone said that it's time for us to put into motion our General Assembly. By now, the English settlers along the Mississippi were in three different towns. We had Mobile, we had Pensacola, we had Campbelltown. And so each of those communities was entitled to send at least one and perhaps two different delegates to this new assembly. And they did. They arrived here in the early part of 1767. And of course, they all came in. They were boarded with the residents here, and they held their meetings in Government House. Now, these people were, of course, they had a charter. They had rules that they could go by, and basically they were to conduct what we would today call in city government ordinances. These were the things that dealt with how the laws and regulations for citizenship and keeping the peace here. And they were quite successful. They met annually for about 2 weeks, and this practice continued for the next 5 years. And the assembly, as I say, we can credit them by saying what Pensacola had its own version of the House of Burgesses that we talked about in Virginia. Well, about this time, something happened that was very uncomfortable for poor Governor Johnstone. As I think we mentioned in our last episode, he had encouraged people to trade with the Spanish over in Louisiana. And we need to talk about that for just a minute. We talk about the Spanish in Louisiana, and that may seem out of place. But with the same treaty that gave Florida to Great Britain, the French gave Louisiana, the Louisiana Territory, to the Spanish to compensate the Spanish for what they had lost in Florida. Now here we are, a largely French colony, which even had all of the Cajuns who had been driven out of Acadia back during the French wars. This was now a French colony, but now became Spanish with Spanish governance. And these were the people that Governor Johnstone encouraged to have trade with Pensacola, and they did. Things were going quite well. Until one day, early in 1767, as a Spanish ship was right here at the Palafox dock doing its business, unexpectedly in comes a British warship. Well, the captain of that warship was one of these spit and polish people. He believed in going by the book, and he knew that what was going on here was illegal. So he went to George Johnstone and said, "Now, Governor, this is illegal. Now, you've got to stop. I want that Spanish ship out of here by 5 o'clock this afternoon. This has got to stop. If you don't, I'll be forced to arrest you and send you back to Britain in chains." Well, you can imagine that sort of took a little bit of the air out of Governor Johnstone's balloon. So within a few months, the trade had stopped, and he decided it was time for him to resign and go back to England, which indeed he did, which left Lieutenant Governor Montfort Brown in charge. Well, Lieutenant Governor Brown was a very aggressive idea man, but he had not had good success in getting along with the other 5 council members. In fact, they'd had a number of rather acrimonious disputes. And so now, as days went by, the council members and Brown began to bicker back and forth with one another, and things just weren't going smoothly. So we come to a time in the early part of 1768 when Governor Governor Brown calls Elias Durnford into the government house. And he says, "Sir, it's been 5 years now. You haven't been home. You haven't had a chance to buy new furniture for your house. I want you to go home, take a leave of absence, go back to England, do your things back home, and while you're there, go and see Lord Bute at the Board of Trade and tell him what's going on here. Tell him what a good job I'm doing, and to do something to put these council people in order." And Durnford said, "I'll be happy to go." Well, of course, back in those days, you didn't go back and forth across the Atlantic in a heartbeat. It took months before Durnford and his lady returned. And of course, you can almost picture Montfort Brown being at the gangway as Durnford came off the ship, anxious to find out what had happened. And of course, Montfort Brown expected that all he had asked for would be granted. And instead, Durnford handed him a paper, which Brown read back to himself. It said basically this: the Board of Trade has heard the arguments put forth by you, as acknowledged by Mr. Durnford, and as a result of that, we are recalling you to England, and we are placing Mr. Durnford in charge as the interim governor. Well, you can imagine what happened to Mr. Brown at that point. He was absolutely furious, and of course he began to be taunted by other members of the Royal Council here who were, of course, not his best friends in any way. And finally the point came when he challenged one of those men to a duel. And these men, fighting with pistols, met under the dueling oak down on the waterfront. A duel was fought, and the councilman was shot and seriously wounded. It looked for a time as though he would die. And of course, if that had happened, it would have been a requirement to send Mr. Montfort Brown back to London to be tried for murder. Happily, the councilman recovered, and Mr. Brown did depart, and that left Mr. Durnford as temporary interim governor here at Pensacola. And he settled in to do his job. Months went by. Things were going along smoothly. The assembly was meeting, the council was meeting, trade was developing, all was well. And then finally, early in 1769, word arrived that a new governor appointee had been made, and his name was to be John Eliot. Well, John Eliot finally arrived. He was single. He had no family with him. He was just a little man, had kind of sparse hair, very thick glasses. He looked like sort of the Casper Milquetoast type of guy, and everyone tried to be very nice to him. And he hadn't been here but a few days, and he confided to Elias Durnford. He said, basically, "I don't know why I'm here. I didn't want the job. I've been in civil service work back there, and I knew something about Pensacola, and they needed someone here, so they appointed me, and well, here I am." 2 weeks went by, and then early in the morning, about 5 a.m., Durnford and his wife were asleep, and they were awakened by a knock on the door, and the corporal of the guard for the night rushed in and said, "Come quickly, sir, something terrible has happened." So Durnford pulled on his breeches. They raced down the street into the government house, and there, with the door wide open, there in the governor's apartment was John Eliot, suspended from a rope. He had hung himself, and he was very dead. Well, to this day, we have no idea what the motive might have been behind his killing himself. Pensacola may not have been the garden spot of the world, but it certainly couldn't have been that bad. But nonetheless, he was very dead, which now left Elias Durnford once again in charge as the interim governor. And he would serve here now for almost 2.5 years before another governor would be appointed. Meanwhile, the colony was prospering, and the one thing that might have been a little bit concern to Durnford was he was getting some reports about the discord that was arising in some of the other English colonies, especially in Boston and around that area, as the post-war activities were beginning to come home to roost. So Durnford, he worked ahead, he did his job, things were going all right, and that's where we will leave our story until we pick up again with the next governor of Florida.